The gray morning sky over the North Atlantic looked calm, too calm for men who knew what hunted beneath it. For months, German U-boats had ruled these waters like ghosts of steel, surfacing only to strike and disappearing before Allied forces could even aim their guns. Convoys burned, ships sank, and thousands of lives were swallowed by the cold ocean depths. In 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was still a brutal chess match.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
And Germany believed their submarines were invincible fortresses under the waves. But they hadn't yet faced a weapon that could quite literally tear them apart from above. At an Allied airfield in Devon, England, Captain Marshal Hawk Hennings stood beside a modified B-25 Mitchell bomber, staring at its new, monstrous face. The aircraft's nose wasn't glass anymore. It was metal, bristling with cannon barrels that jutted forward like the fangs of a mechanical beast. It looked less like an airplane and more like a weapon designed for vengeance. The ground crew called it the Sawfish. Engineers called it a dangerous experiment. The Germans, soon enough, would call it something else entirely, an abomination. Marshall had seen too many ships go down to care what anyone called it. He'd flown long enough to understand one thing: traditional bombing wasn't working. The U-boats were too fast to track, too well-armored to destroy with near misses. Something new had to be done, something brutal, precise, and terrifying. So when the engineers of the Allied Coastal Command proposed mounting twin 75mm cannons directly into the nose of a B-25, he volunteered without hesitation. Most pilots thought it was suicide. The recoil alone could shake the aircraft apart. The reload time was abysmal. And yet, Marshall's voice was steady as he said, "Let's see if we can turn a bomber into a submarine hunter." The first test flight was nothing short of chaos. As soon as the cannons fired, the entire plane shuddered violently. Instruments rattled, and one of the crew swore he saw rivets fly off the fuselage. The engineers panicked, thinking the idea was a failure. But Marshall's grin stayed fixed as he brought the B-25 around for another pass, testing the limits of control. "She's got teeth," he said through the radio, "and she just needs to learn how to bite." Word spread quickly through the airbase about the cannon Mitchell. Pilots gathered in disbelief, staring at the massive nose guns that could blow holes through concrete. To many, it felt like desperation, a last gamble by an air force running out of tricks. But desperation is often where innovation is born. The air crews began training relentlessly, practicing strafing runs on old shipwrecks and hulks left in the harbor. Every pass improved their timing, their coordination, their aim. And every time those cannons roared, the air filled with shock waves that shook the coastline. Across the Channel, in occupied France, German naval officers studied their intercepted reports with equal parts arrogance and confusion. A twin-engine bomber attacking submarines with cannons? Absurd! The U-boats dove too deep, too fast for such an aircraft to ever find them. They waste their fuel chasing ghosts, one officer scoffed at a briefing, confident that German steel still owned the seas. The Atlantic, after all, had been their silent domain for years. They had never faced a threat that could hunt them above the waves and strike before they even submerged. Meanwhile, the crews at Devon continued their transformation. What started as a bomber squadron was turning into something stranger. Half airmen, half engineers, driven by a shared obsession to make this deadly new weapon work. The hangars echoed with the sound of tools and cannon shells clinking together, the smell of oil and cordite thick in the air. The mechanics reinforced the fuselage with extra bracing. The gunners learned to reload faster, sweating as they manhandled heavy shells mid-flight. Every man involved knew that the moment they faced a real U-boat, there'd be no second chances. The morning of their first mission arrived cold and heavy with fog. Intelligence had reported a wolf pack, 3 German submarines, surfacing to refuel somewhere off the coast of Brittany. The Sawfish's engines roared to life and the ground trembled. As the bomber lifted into the mist, Marshall looked down at the shrinking airfield below and thought of the countless sailors whose ships had gone under. This wasn't just another mission, it was retribution. Hours later, the North Atlantic opened beneath them in endless gray. The crew scanned the horizon through the haze until the radio man's voice cracked through. Surface contact, bearing 090, distance 2 miles. Marshall tightened his grip on the controls, heart pounding. The ocean below rippled faintly, and then, like shadows emerging from fog, 3 dark shapes appeared. The U-boats were surfaced, exposed, recharging their batteries. Perfect targets. The Sawfish dove. The Germans spotted the bomber too late, scrambling across their decks toward the conning towers. Cannon fire thundered through the sky. The first shell hit near the stern of the lead U-boat, splitting the hull open like a seam under pressure. Water erupted upward in a violent plume. The second cannon boomed, and striking the submarine's center line, in one horrifying instant, the vessel cracked in 2. It wasn't just sunk, it was obliterated. For a brief moment, silence filled the air, broken only by the hiss of escaping steam and the distant cries of men in the water. The other U-boats panicked, diving desperately, but the Sawfish circled like a predator. Its next shots tore into the waves where a periscope had just dipped, shattering the surface with fury. The once invisible hunters of the deep had just met a weapon they could neither outswim nor outshoot. When Marshall and his crew returned to base, the airmen waiting on the tarmac didn't need words. The sight of their aircraft, blackened with powder burns and streaked with salt water, said everything. For the first time in years, the ocean didn't belong to the U-boats. It belonged to the sky. And though Germany didn't know it yet, the era of the unstoppable submarine had just begun to crack, split open by a new kind of weapon they had never imagined possible.
Germany refused to believe the reports. The idea that a medium bomber, something designed to drop bombs from above, not fired directly forward, could destroy a U-boat in a single pass sounded like a propaganda fantasy. The Kriegsmarine's high command laughed off the claims, chalking them up to Allied exaggeration. Even if it were true, one officer scoffed, they can't fire those cannons without tearing the plane apart. But within days, photographs from wreckage patrols began to surface. Grainy black and white images of twisted submarine hulls split cleanly in 2, lying half-submerged like broken bones. Something was happening in the Atlantic, and the Germans had no explanation. In Devon, Captain Marshal Hennings and his squadron were still perfecting the impossible. Their first mission had proven the concept, but it had also exposed their vulnerability. The recoil from the 75mm cannon was so powerful, it nearly stalled the plane each time it fired. The targeting system was crude. They relied entirely on instinct, experience, and luck. The gunners had to reload manually, crouching in the cramped fuselage while the aircraft bucked through turbulent air. It was insane, yet it worked. To improve the design, the engineers and pilots spent every spare hour in the hangars. Sheets of schematics covered the walls. They experimented with reinforced mounts, recoil dampeners, and faster reload mechanisms. The ground crews treated the bomber like a living thing, patching its wounds and strengthening its bones after every sortie. Marshall watched it evolve from an unstable experiment into a precision weapon, one that blurred the line between aircraft and artillery. Meanwhile, across the channel, the German naval strategists faced a growing dilemma. U-boats that once operated near the English coast were vanishing. Survivors from one crew, rescued after days adrift, described a flying machine that shot flames and thunder before their sub split apart.
Others spoke of a bomber that did not drop bombs but fired shells straight through the hull. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The story has sounded unbelievable. Fairy tales of a desperate crew hallucinating under stress, but too many accounts aligned. The U-boat commanders demanded answers. Admiral Dieter Kranz, the man overseeing Germany's Atlantic submarine fleet, wasn't one to be swayed by rumors. He had built his reputation on data, not ghost stories. But when one of his most trusted captains, Otto Behrens, sent word that his U-213 had narrowly escaped a forward-firing Allied aircraft with cannon fire, Kranz ordered a full review. If such a weapon truly existed, it represented a threat unlike any they had faced before. He knew that the U-boat arm was the Reich's lifeline. It was the only thing still choking Britain's supply routes. If that lifeline was severed, Germany's war effort would suffocate. While the Germans scrambled to make sense of the mystery, the British High Command was equally divided. Some officials praised the B-25 cannon program as a game-changer. Others considered it an expensive stunt. "It's too unpredictable," one officer argued. "If those cannons jam mid-flight, the plane becomes useless." But the field results spoke louder than doubts. Each successful sortie sank a submarine, and with each mission, the technology improved. Marshall's squadron became known unofficially as the Sawfish unit. They painted shark teeth along the cannon barrels and started marking silhouettes of destroyed U-boats beneath the cockpit window. Each marking was both a victory and a message. The hunters of the deep now had something to fear above. But fear is never one-sided. The Sawfish crews carried it with them too, hidden beneath their bravado. Every flight over the Atlantic was a roll of the dice. They faced not only enemy fighters and flak, but the violent physics of their own invention. Once, during a training exercise, one cannon misfired, the recoil snapping them out and blowing shrapnel through the cockpit. The co-pilot lost an eye, the engineer nearly lost his hand. Marshall grounded the plane, standing silently beside it as smoke drifted from its nose. War isn't about what's safe, it's about what works. Soon, the missions grew bolder. The squadron pushed deeper into enemy territory, striking U-boats while they refueled near the Bay of Biscay. These were the most dangerous targets, protected by anti-aircraft ships and Luftwaffe patrols. But Marshall's team had developed a new rhythm: attack low, hit fast, and disappear before anyone could respond. They flew like shadows skimming the sea. During one mission, they found themselves ambushed by two Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. The Sawfish wasn't built for dogfights. Its heavy cannons made it sluggish. Marshall ordered the bomber down to wave-top level, the wings nearly grazing the water. The German fighters followed, guns blazing, their tracer rounds carving lines across the waves. "Hold steady," Marshall shouted, lining up a desperate shot, not at the planes, but at the ocean ahead. The cannon roared, and the explosion of seawater momentarily blinded the Germans. When they recovered, the Sawfish was gone, vanished into the fog. It was a close call, but it cemented something within the crew. They were not just test pilots anymore. They were predators. Back in Berlin, the German engineers began working on countermeasures. They reinforced submarine decks, adjusted dive protocols, and ordered patrols to surface less often. But these adaptations came at a cost. The submarines now stayed submerged longer, which meant less time to refuel and fewer attacks on Allied shipping. The once feared wolf packs were shrinking into isolated, cautious hunters. Germany had always believed that the ocean was its fortress, but now that fortress had cracks. Each report of another submarine destroyed struck like a tremor through the command structure. Admiral Dieter Kranz finally admitted to his staff what no one dared say aloud: "If this continues, the Atlantic will belong to them." Back in Devon, Marshall knew it was only the beginning. The airbase buzzed with a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion. Mechanics slept beside their tools, and pilots walked like ghosts between missions. Yet amidst the fatigue, a quiet determination grew. They had proven something no one believed possible: that an aircraft could challenge the sea itself.
As dusk settled one evening, Marshall stood beside his plane, watching the horizon fade into gray. The ocean had swallowed thousands, and he had sworn to strike back for every life lost. He touched the cold metal of the Sawfish's cannon barrels and whispered, "Let's see how long the deep can hide." Germany could no longer deny what was coming. The age of the untouchable submarine was ending, and the skies above the Atlantic were no longer a refuge. They were a threat. The clash between steel and sky had begun, and the balance of power was shifting in a way no admiral had ever imagined.
The North Atlantic was never silent. Even on calm days, the waves carried whispers. Engines far below, steel cutting through the cold darkness, the pulse of unseen movement beneath the surface. But on a gray morning in early spring, those whispers turned into screams. What happened that day would shake German command to its core and make every U-boat captain question the very waters they once ruled. Captain Marshall Hennings and his Sawfish crew had been tracking a U-boat convoy for nearly 6 hours. They were low on fuel, the engines humming a tired rhythm, and their nerves frayed from the constant search. Intelligence suggested the submarines were transporting something valuable, encrypted materials, perhaps even prototype torpedo systems, along the Norwegian coast. If they could strike this convoy, it would be more than a victory. It would be a message. The sea stretched endlessly beneath them, cold and merciless. Then suddenly the radio man's voice broke through. "Surface contact, bearing 215. Marshall leaned forward, squinting into the horizon. The clouds parted just enough to reveal a glimmer of metal below, a surfaced U-boat, its crew scurrying like ants on deck. And beside it, another submarine, tethered for refueling. 2 targets, side by side. Marshall exhaled slowly. "All right, boys," he said, gripping the controls. "Let's show 'em what thunder looks like." The Sawfish roared into a shallow dive, engine screaming as wind clawed at its fuselage. The crew locked into position, gunner ready, reloader braced, navigator holding his breath. At 300 feet, the ocean seemed close enough to touch. The German crews on the decks looked up too late. The first 75mm shell left the barrel with a deafening crack, trailing smoke as it tore through the morning air. It struck the forward deck of the nearest submarine, erupting in a blast that ripped the hull open like paper. Men were thrown into the sea, their shouts swallowed by the chaos. Before the spray settled, the second cannon fired. The shell slammed through the conning tower of the second U-boat, shattering steel, instruments, and bone alike. The submarine buckled, then split along its centerline, cut clean in half by sheer kinetic force. The Sawfish soared through the smoke, its engines howling like an animal unleashed. The crew inside barely registered the recoil anymore. They were too focused, too alive. The radio crackled with cheers from escorting aircraft watching from afar. "Direct hit! My God, it's gone! The whole sub's gone!" Marshall didn't celebrate. He just brought the plane around, scanning for survivors. The sea was a graveyard now, oil fires spreading, debris scattered, the smell of burning fuel and seawater mixing into something unforgettable. A few figures clung to wreckage, waving frantically, but Marshall knew they couldn't stop. Another U-boat was diving nearby, its shadow slipping beneath the waves. "Last shell!" the gunner called out. "Make it count!" Marshall leveled the plane and fired. The ocean erupted where the sub had been moments before, a massive plume rising like the breath of some awakened beast. When the water settled, there was nothing. No trace of metal or man. Just silence. That silence followed them all the way back to Devon. When they landed, mechanics rushed to inspect the aircraft, their eyes wide at the scorch marks and dented panels. The entire base seemed to vibrate with word of what had happened. "Cut in half? You're telling me they split a U-boat clean through?" The photos developed that evening confirmed it. The aerial shot showed a U-boat literally torn apart, its 2 halves drifting miles apart before sinking. Even seasoned officers stared at the images in stunned silence. For years, submarines had been the ultimate predator of the sea, unseen, untouchable. Now they had met a hunter they couldn't evade. The British press caught wind of the operation within days. Newspapers ran headlines like "Allied aircraft saws through German submarines" and "The new cannon that split steel." While many assumed it was exaggerated propaganda, those inside the military knew better.
The technology was real, and its success was undeniable. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Admiral Kranz stood over a conference table littered with reports. The latest one, stamped "Top Secret," contained aerial reconnaissance photographs of the destroyed convoy. His officers avoided his gaze. The sight of 2 U-boats reduced to twisted metal shook even the most loyal believers in Germany's naval supremacy. "This is no fluke," he muttered. "They've built something new, something made to kill us before we can even dive." One of his aides hesitated before asking, "What do we do, sir?" Kranz didn't answer immediately. He turned to the window, watching the cold rain streak down the glass. "We adapt or we drown," he said finally. Across the channel, the Sawfish crews were already planning their next strike. They had tasted proof of what their machine could do, and it had changed them. The airbase that once echoed with doubt now buzzed with purpose. Crews volunteered to join the new Thundernose project, modified B-25s with reinforced mounts and automatic reloading systems. The line between bomber and battleship was blurring. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marshall sat on the wing of his plane, the ocean wind cutting through his flight jacket. He stared at the battered nose of the Sawfish, still blackened from cannon fire. He said no plane could fight a submarine. Now they'll learn that the sea doesn't belong to them anymore. Somewhere out in the Atlantic, German submarines crept silently beneath the waves, unaware that the next time they surfaced, the sky itself would come for them. And for the first time in years, the hunters of the deep began to feel what their prey once did. Fear.
The skies above the Atlantic changed almost overnight. Where once U-boats prowled freely, surfacing to strike or refuel without fear, now they hesitated, haunted by stories of flying bombers with cannons that could split steel in half. What had begun as a single experimental squadron in Devon evolved into an entire network of specialized anti-submarine units. The Sawfish had proven the concept, and now the Allies began to replicate it. Dozens of B-25 Mitchells were modified across bases in England, Scotland, and Iceland. Crews worked around the clock fitting 75mm and 57mm cannons into aircraft noses, reinforcing airframes, and training pilots to fire them with surgical precision. Each passing week brought fresh reports of success. A U-boat caught near the Bay of Biscay, destroyed. Another one off the coast of Norway, cut in half. Allied intelligence estimated submarine losses had nearly doubled within a month. Convoys that once lived in constant fear began to move more boldly across the Atlantic. Merchant captains cheered when they spotted the sleek silhouettes of the cannon-equipped Mitchells flying overhead. Sky shields, they called them, angels with guns. But with each victory came escalation. Germany, cornered and humiliated, sought new ways to fight back. Admiral Kranz ordered the development of heavy flak traps, fake supply ships bristling with hidden anti-aircraft guns. He ordered U-boats to carry their own deck-mounted cannons and surface only in groups, using overlapping fire to repel air attacks. And deep in occupied France, Luftwaffe squadrons were reassigned to coastal defense, tasked with hunting the Sawfish bombers. The Atlantic was becoming a chessboard of retaliation. Marshal Hennings and his crew were in the center of it. Their fame spread quietly among Allied ranks. They were respected, even feared, not just for their results but for their nerve. Yet Marshall himself grew quieter with every mission. The thrill of innovation had faded, replaced by the grim realization of what they had created. The Sawfish wasn't a miracle anymore. It was a machine of destruction, and every mission left ghosts in its wake. One mission in late spring would define everything that followed. Intelligence had located a hidden U-boat pen carved into the cliffs of western France, a heavily fortified base where submarines were repaired and refueled in secrecy.
Destroying it would cripple Germany's Atlantic operations, but it was nearly suicidal. The base was defended by radar, flak towers, and fighter patrols. Still, Marshall volunteered. "We built this weapon to end the hunt," he told his commander. "Let's finish it." Before dawn, the squadron lifted off from Devon. The clouds were thick and low, the sea invisible beneath them. Marshall's heart pounded as he glanced at the small photograph taped to his dashboard. His younger brother, a merchant sailor, lost to a U-boat 2 years before. He didn't need orders or medals. He only needed justice. Hours later, the French coastline emerged through the mist. The cliffs loomed ahead, jagged and dark. Spotlights swept across the water as German flak batteries began to open fire, turning the sky into a storm of light and sound. The Sawfish dove straight into it. Cannon shells and tracer fire screamed past, shaking the aircraft. "Hold steady," Marshall shouted. "Target those pens." The first 75mm round hit the cliffside, tearing through the concrete bunker entrance. A second followed, then a third, each blast cracking the reinforced walls. From below, a submarine was seen scrambling to submerge inside the pen, desperate to escape. But before it could sink, a shell pierced the opening directly and detonated inside. The explosion ripped through the structure, collapsing part of the cliff. Flames and seawater erupted upward together, swallowing the submarine whole. The recoil from the final shot jolted the plane so hard that one engine sputtered and caught fire. The co-pilot fought to keep control, shouting over the roar of flames. "We're losing pressure." "I know," Marshall barked, gripping the controls with everything he had. Smoke filled the cockpit as alarms wailed. Behind them, the sky was a chaos of destruction. The U-boat base in ruins, the sea boiling with fire. They barely made it back to open water. The Sawfish limped over the channel, one engine dead, riddled with holes. By the time they crossed the English coast, Marshall's vision blurred from exhaustion and smoke. "We made it," the navigator whispered. Marshall smiled faintly, barely. When they landed, the ground crews rushed to pull them out. Half the fuselage was scorched, the cannon barrels warped from overuse. The Sawfish had given everything it had. As Marshall stepped onto the tarmac, the base commander met him with silent respect. No speeches, no medals, just a nod that said it all. The U-boat base was gone. Word spread across Europe faster than any propaganda. The Luftwaffe pilots who arrived at the smoking ruins saw something that chilled them. A single set of 75mm shell fragments lodged deep in the wreckage. One of the Germans murmured, "It's like the sky itself fired a cannon." From that day on, every U-boat captain knew the truth. The Atlantic was no longer their hunting ground. It was their graveyard. They began surfacing less, diving deeper, their missions shortened and their confidence broken. Even the most veteran commanders admitted what they'd never said out loud. "If we surface, we die." In Berlin, Admiral Kranz threw his final report across the table. "They've taken the ocean from us," he hissed. "The very thing that made us powerful is now what kills us." But in Devon, Marshall stood alone in the hangar that night, looking at the crippled Sawfish. Mechanics moved quietly around it, preparing to salvage what they could. He reached out, running his hand along the battered nose, black with soot and salt. "You did it," he whispered. "You changed everything." The dominoes had fallen. The hunter had become the hunted. The war beneath the waves was over, and the men who fought it had learned that even the deepest sea cannot hide from the reach of the sky.
The Atlantic finally grew quiet. The same ocean that had once devoured convoys and dreams now shimmered in stillness under a new dawn. Weeks passed with no confirmed U-boat attacks. The survivors of the Allied fleets began to speak in reverence, not of victory,
but of deliverance. Somewhere above that vast blue expanse, men like Marshal Hennings had rewritten the laws of war, not with superiority, but with sheer willpower and the courage to challenge the impossible. The Sawfish never flew again. Its final mission had burned its engines beyond repair, its frame warped by the pressure of history itself. It sat in the hangar like a monument of iron and memory. Mechanics refused to dismantle it. Pilots who passed by often paused to rest a hand on its scarred skin, whispering their thanks before walking away in silence. One foggy morning, Marshall stood at the edge of the runway, staring at the Atlantic horizon. For the first time, there were no explosions, no alarms, no enemy lurking beneath the waves. Just the sound of seagulls and the distant hum of wind against steel. His mind replayed the countless nights when he believed they would never make it home. Now they had, because they refused to give up when reason said they should. As the sun broke through the clouds, golden light spilled across the Sawfish fuselage. It glinted off the faded insignia painted months ago, a leaping swordfish through a wave, and for a fleeting second, the aircraft looked alive again. "War ends," Marshall whispered, "but courage doesn't." Behind him, a young mechanic approached hesitantly. "Sir," he asked, "do you think anyone will remember what we did here?" Marshall smiled faintly, eyes still on the sea. "They'll remember the idea," he said, "that no wall, no storm, no ocean is too deep when men decide to rise above it." That same week, orders came to decommission the special cannon-fitted squadrons. The war was turning, D-Day was on the horizon, and the fight was moving east. But the legacy of the Sawfish lived on. Its blueprints inspired generations of engineers. Its tactics became the foundation of post-war aerial warfare. And for Marshall and his crew, it was more than a mission. It was proof that innovation born of desperation could become salvation for thousands. Years later, when the war was only a story whispered through a museum glass, the remnants of the Sawfish were displayed in the quiet coastal hangar. Tourists walked by, unaware of the countless lives it had saved, until they read the small plaque beneath it. This aircraft helped end the Battle of the Atlantic. Against all odds, it proved that courage can turn the tide of history. Old veterans would sometimes visit, standing silently before it. Some would salute, some would shed tears. And once, on a gray afternoon, an old man with a weathered face and eyes like steel came to see it one last time. He placed a small photo, a young sailor smiling, beside the landing gear. Then he straightened his posture and whispered, "You brought him home." He turned, walking into the mist that rolled in from the sea, leaving only the sound of the wind moving softly through the hangar. Because the Sawfish wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of how innovation born from despair can shatter the darkness, of how ordinary men, cornered by circumstance, can become the architects of miracles, and of how sometimes, to defeat the monsters that hide in the deep, humanity must first conquer its own fear. In the years that followed, the Atlantic's silence became sacred. Every sailor who crossed it would look up when a plane passed overhead, remembering the angels with cannons who once guarded those waters. History books would call it the turning point, but for those who lived it, it was something far greater. It was proof that hope, when armed with courage, could change the course of destiny. As the final light of day faded across the waves, a simple truth echoed through time. Heroes are not born in comfort, they are forged in the storm. And somewhere, beyond the clouds and memory, the Sawfish still soars, not in war, but in legend. A reminder that even in our darkest hours, humanity can build wings powerful enough to reach the impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.